So we're back for our next episode for Spacebar and our opportunity to have mindful pauses for conscious conversations. And my name is Yvette, and I'm the daughter.
And my name is Linda, and I'm the mother. Help.
So yes, well, we know who's who now.
Right.
So I think that what we can start with is just to kind of recap from our last episode, which we really kind of focused on why we're here and where we want to go with this podcast and what it means to us. Is there anything that came up for you after the podcast that in our conversation that you thought, oh, darn it, I wish I would have brought that up?
Yes, I did think of probably two of the most important things that I left out of our last conversation was John Bradshaw and his inner child work,
Mhm.
and Melanie Beatty's Codependent No More. The those were really the start of my journey of becoming not dysfunctional anymore.
Mhm.
And so I highly recommend those books. I don't know if they're still available or not. I'm sure Bradshaw's books are. And Melanie Beatty is part of the Adult Children of Alcoholics.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm sure that hers are still around, that people
Oh,
can get
yeah.
them.
Yeah, I'm sure they
I
are. So that would that kind of leads us into our topics today, which are addressing the mother wound. And this is for, obviously, we're just two women talking about this subject, but at the same time, men also suffer from the mother wound. So we'll talk about that, and then we can get into another topic, which is about growth versus happiness. But I was thinking, for myself before we get into the topic of the mother wound, if there was anything that I had missed on sharing. And I think in walking away from our conversation, which is what I find so interesting about our relationship, and it's been this way since I was a little girl. And this is what I learned from you and your friends and you and grandma, was the effortless flow of conversation. There wasn't a subject. There were things that were taboo that were not discussed, but at the
Right.
same time, the open forum of conversation amongst women, the open conversation, whether it was, Thanksgiving dinner. And I mean, I can't tell you how many Thanksgivings at grandma that I remember of. We had Thanksgiving dinner, and then the conversation just flowed over to eventually we had Thanksgiving supper because
True.
yeah, because we sat at the table for hours and hours
Oh,
and hours
yes.
and talked about everything under the planet. So in an effort of sharing gratitude of where that came from, it's so easy. I mean, I've sat at captain's tables where I've had to struggle to make conversation, to get people to have conversation. So I get the other side of it. But I also get the appreciation of the effortless camaraderie that happens, that has happened in our relationship. And on top of that, the ability to share space in silence, without having to have conversation. And in the in that, I remember as well is when I lived in Nashville, and you were in the bedroom, you were working, and something I answered a question that you were getting ready to ask me.
Yeah.
And so that's what also happens in the spaces of that comfortable silence of sharing space. Words are they can bastardize the experience, but at the same time, when you tune into someone's vibe to that level, and you can have conscious conversation that gets inspired because you pick up on someone's vibes. And that has also been a part of our relationship. So that's something I wanted to share from that came up for me from last week.
Well, those are nice memories that you brought. I was just thinking of the times that I used to host dinners and invite my friends over or business associates, and I never made you leave. I always
Mhm.
included you, so you got to hear all kinds of of conversations.
Yep. Oh
You were
yeah.
in charge of desserts, I think.
Yeah, that's eventually when I got old enough, I was in charge of desserts. So you
Yeah.
did everything else and I made the dessert. So that was my contribution to the experience. But in thinking about that, children should be seen and not heard. In
Mm.
some ways, I grew up with that because I mean, I wasn't really old enough to contribute to those conversations that were so adult and so intellectual, and politics and religion and you name it was passed around the table. So I wasn't evolved enough at that point, and what kid would be, when you're 9 or 10 years old. But it really laid great seeds that sprouted amazing opportunities when I got into working on ships, because I was so accustomed to all kinds of people passing through our doors that as a career choice, it was effortless as well. It made sense, that all clicked.
I have a distinct memory of the first ship that mom and I came on, the Sea Breeze. We came
Hmm.
to see you, and you one night you invited us to a captain's dinner, but you said you have to sit in the back and sort of not be seen because the captain's dinners were for repeat customers, and we were not repeat customers.
Hmm.
So grandma and I sat, so we got to observe, and we got
Yeah.
to observe you and beside the captain and doing all the introductions and having those conversations. And I remember saying to you when at the end, when you came over to talk to us, that where did you get that talent? I mean, I had never thought about where that came from, because I'm an introvert basically, and you're more extroverted than I
Yeah.
am.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. So I remember you saying all of those conversations, all of those dinners that we had had at our house, and all of the places I had dragged you off to
Yeah.
over the years. Yeah, that's where you got it. So
Yeah.
you really do, that goes to show you that you do learn from the models that your parents do,
Mm-hmm.
a role model for you, and you learn from them. And
Yep.
I guess I just never thought about that before.
Well, I just for our listeners, that was the captain's VIP party that we used to do once a cruise. I don't
Okay.
want people to think that you were putting like in that movie, Dirty Dancing, and no one puts baby in the corner. It wasn't one of those situations where you were sitting at the kids' table and only the adults could, sit at the big table with the captain. It was the VIP party, and there was probably 150 people there easily. Yeah.
Yeah. And you just had such grace and poise to be moving through those people and speaking to them. It just amazed me, but it amazed me more when you told me where it came from.
But if that was a room of my peers, if I was in that role as a social hostess, I could do it, but as myself, because it's almost as if I put on my uniform, became a costume, and it became the thing of which helped me navigate those waters. So I was so comfortable talking to people who were older than me, who were your age and older, because of, being born into a family that my great grandparents were alive when I was born. But having that multi-generational upbringing benefited me in a way. But because I didn't have brothers and sisters, and we didn't really live in a neighborhood that had a lot of kids, I didn't have that peer-to-peer skill set. So it's something, that part I've had to cultivate and work on, and find a comfort zone with it. But if you put me in a room with all my peers and said, go do the same thing, I had to go put my uniform on and then and then go and do it. It would be work. It would take some work. It would take
I
some work.
didn't know that. Well, that's good. You told me something I didn't know.
Yep,
I
there you
feel
go.
and I feel better now because I can't do
All right, so let's dive into the mother wound. And this is a term that I don't know where that came up, but I think it's interesting, as there's a mother wound between families, between mothers and their children. And there's also the mother wound of what Mother Earth experiences and puts out for us, because we just dealt with obviously the hurricane
Yes.
Idalia, and I personally spent the last year recovering from the impact of Ian. And
Yes.
that's Mother Earth, and there's the mother wound that's going on. If we get into, climate change, which is a whole other podcast for us, but so let's start by talking about the mother wound, and what that term means to you.
Can I say first that I have come to think of the mother wound in the same way for the earth as I do for women. I mean, what respect do we have? Women are 50% of the population, but look at where we are. We're starting to go back to the dark ages again with the kind of legislature that's being passed in all the states, and look at women with their burqas, and it's just really it's the same thing. I don't know if people associate the two, but that's how I feel. I feel like
Hmm.
you can associate. And the mother wound, I think, happens and can happen in a lot of ways, and women don't understand that it plays out in their relationships. And so I would say probably mine did not show up until I was probably about 40.
Hmm.
And where it came from, as best I can explain it, is that I think I mentioned this last time, that no one knew what my name was. I mean, I was Lil's daughter, period. So I really had no identity of my own. And that's just, people say that kind of sounds ridiculous, but that was very true. I identified with whatever my mother identified with. But when that came to an end around age 40, and I think I woke up. I mean, I felt like I
Hmm.
was sleeping all that time, and I woke up to understand that. And it probably was the therapist who helped me to identify that. Um, and then I had to start fixing it. I had to start recovering from that. I had to recover myself mostly. That's how it
Hmm.
showed up in me, because I was my mother.
Hmm.
I wasn't me. And it look how many years it took me. I mean, I was 55 when I found my career. That's kind of late.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well,
more importantly, how did that show up as I began to recover from that, so to speak? How did that show up in you? What difference did that make to you, that I was healing that in myself?
hmm, that's a really good question. And I have another question for you too. And
Okay.
I hope to remember it, which actually I'm going to mention it now so I don't forget.
Okay.
Because what I'm really curious about is, as you began to do that recovery work on who you were, and number one, how did you recognize what your true identity was as you uncovered those layers and healing the mother, excuse me, healing the mother wound? That's number one. And number two, as you began to blossom as your authentic self of who Linda was meant to be, how did you navigate the rough waters that came when grandma rejected that part of you, when you were no longer a reflection of who she was? And that, so those are two questions I have for you to come back to.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, and they're big questions that deserve space to be answered, because I think that anyone who hears what you have to share can benefit from it.
Mhm.
Um, I think that, so going to answer your question about how did that benefit me, is that I never felt that I had a mother wound. I came to recognize, and doing that inner work, seeing myself on the inside, that there was one, which I'll share momentarily, but most of what I had to deal with and address in myself was the father wound, because my father abandoned me. And at least that's my perception. And in that, I know that there are children who have been abandoned by mothers as well as fathers. It's not exclusive to one gender. But seeing you do that work on yourself, and as you began to reparent me, there came a softening in you that relaxed in me. And I think that because you did that work and you were doing the work on yourself of learning how to accept yourself and learning how to allow yourself to blossom, I really think that's where the roots and wings came from, that philosophy was able, because you had been boxed in as a reflection of your mother, a mini me, so to speak, all
Yeah.
of your life. And it must have felt extremely freeing to set yourself free from that, from like, it's like untying the strings when you're going up in a hot air balloon, and you're lifting and lifting. Eventually they got to let the sandbags out because you got to go up. Um and it must have felt that way in some ways for you, very, very freeing. So I think you being that example in reparenting yourself, you you softened some of the rigidity that grandma held you to. um it's almost that you didn't want me to experience the same thing, so you softened in that, um which gave me even more room to be myself.
The reparenting, I think, I don't know if people understand or not, but when they raise their children, they have an opportunity to reparent themselves.
Hmm.
And I kind of woke up to that. I thought this is really great. I get to do things with Yvette that I did my mom didn't get to do with me. And so it was like a reparenting of myself. I mean, I taught you how to swim and I was scared to death of water. I mean, we that was just one of the things that I could. But you talk about freeing. It's really interesting because it's about as scary as it is freeing, because if you don't know who you are, you kind of grasp onto anything, almost anything, anybody, to try to identify with them. And
Hmm.
so uh it's like being empty inside and then trying to find something to fill you up with, because you don't know where to start or how to
Hmm.
be. So my mother rejected that. I mean, she was not happy. She never, it was really sad to me because she never recovered from that relationship, that new relationship, which I tried so many different ways to try to have with her.
Hmm.
And I remember one time, distinctly remember having asked her if she would go with me to a retreat for a weekend. It was a mother-daughter retreat. Oh, she kind of bristled and said, "No, thank you. You do your thing and I'll do mine." So that whole
That's so grandma, so
mother,
grandma.
and I don't want to portray my mom as some witch. I don't want
No,
her
she
to.
wasn't.
No,
No.
she was a fun lady.
Yep.
And so, and our whole family enjoyed that side of her.
Hmm.
It was just trying to negotiate the rough waters, as you said, was not an easy thing. But I truly made up my mind. And I think this is where some women don't do the same thing. Whether she liked it or not, I was not going to let go of that relationship. I was not going to just forget about it and walk away from it. So we moved to New England, and we moved to Western Pennsylvania during that
Hmm.
time. And so I just kept calling. It was very difficult for a long time to find conversation. You talked about how easy that conversation was to flowed.
Hmm.
That wasn't so easy anymore to find things to talk about. I had to tiptoe through the tulips, so to speak. But the thing was, I feel like I made it. I
Hmm.
I finally arrived when I took my job with Natural Awakenings,
Mhm.
that was really the time for my personality, me to unfold. It's like
Mhm.
a rose bloom, the bud, it just unfolds. It doesn't become something.
Mhm.
It is something inside. And as it just opens, it leaves this fragrance. And that was a chance for me to do that. And I've loved, all 20 years of it.
Yep, yep. I know it's had its ups and downs, obviously,
Oh,
as
yeah.
any job it
Yeah.
has. It's not all, you know, Twinkies and butterflies and rainbows and all that, but I think as part of that journey, the rough spots they make the hike up to the top of the mountain where you appreciate what it is that you've done and what you've contributed. You can, in the pain, you can appreciate the opportunity, and you can appreciate the growth. So you don't look at it as a place of suffering. It's just, this is what I had to go through in order to, you know be at the top.
Right.
But you mentioned about how you didn't want to portray grandma as being this witch, and she wasn't. And she probably is she had such a great sense of humor. She's a great cook. I mean, there were so many aspects of grandma that were just awesome. And I think over the years, I think she was softer with me. I think most grandparents are
Yeah.
softer with their grandchildren than they are with their kids. But there's a reason for it. And I think one of the first steps in healing the mother wound is to accept that your mother, or your father in my case, was who he or she was as a result of how they were raised. That And they did with us what how they were treated. I mean, it's just a process. It's a conditioning that we end up in, and it just gets perpetuated. Um, but compassion goes such a long way, with compassion for the self, or even taking the whole thing personally, as well as compassion for the parent, because they did what they knew.
Well,
And you know putting
mhm.
food on the table, or surviving. And it's one of those things that you just have to, well, you don't have to accept it, but the only way to really get to that healing process is to accept that's how they were. That's how they were with you, and realize that there's so much more inside of you waiting to bust out and not live in the confines of that anymore.
As you say those things, it reminds me that probably to say to people, my mother was raised on the tail end of the Depression. I mean, I was born in 1947, so I was a war baby. That's what usually people called them, um, and that was a whole different lifestyle that most people don't understand today because they don't have to. They don't have to live it.
Mm-mm.
So I think that has a lot to do with the way mom was raised and then the
Mm.
way that I was raised. So, but when you decide not to repeat that, you actually make a decision, and that's what I did when I found started to find myself, is that I'm not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so you do have to you then it's a whole new learning process, which your
Yeah.
children get to learn.
Yep. You reminded me of when I was working on a ship. We were over in Europe, and it was the 50-year anniversary of the storming of Normandy Beach.
Hmm.
And on this particular voyage, we had, probably, because we used to do a veterans get together, so it was not uncommon to have fellow vets on board, and they were usually a small group. They weren't anything significant. But for this, obviously, all these men who had survived World War II were on board to go back for the actual event, which was taking place on Normandy Beach. And our veterans get together was, I want to say, 900 people.
Oh,
900. It was phenomenal.
on the
And
ship.
on the ship.
Wow.
And these men, there were men in that room who got up to share their experiences
Oh,
many years later, decades later, that they found other men in that room who had served in the same unit, the same platoon that they hadn't seen since that time. At the same time, we had a veterans' wives get together upstairs in the crow's nest. And that was quite significant in that the women shared that when their husbands came home from that war, they never spoke of their experiences. It was a stiff upper lip, and no level of vulnerability is going to, show. So I can only imagine being a child of the war, being a war baby, like you were saying, as yourself and so many others, growing up in a household with this is just, we'll never speak of it. And these men carried these emotional wounds that they had from watching their friends and comrades die in front of them. They never spoke of it. So imagine holding all that emotion in for fear that you could never let it out because you might crumble. We wouldn't. We're human beings. We're not meant to. But how that has affected generations of children being born, as Bruce Lipton talks about epigenetics, we know it's a real thing. So holding in emotions, not allowing yourselves to be vulnerable is detrimental to your health, and that not just your physical health, but the health of your relationships.
I it reminds me that my uncle Kenneth came home with a Purple Heart. He put it in a drawer and never spoke of it. We never heard how he died. We had no idea how he got it. I mean, it was for bravery, but
Mhm.
and then that's the truth, is that they never ever spoke of
Mhm.
it again.
Nope.
And I can't imagine living with that for all those years. And it
Mhm.
did affect the parenting for sure,
Mhm.
children.
Yep. Oh yeah. In with the mother wound, I know someone who's been in multiple relationships and married and divorced a number of times. And this particular person is a walking example of trying to heal your mother wound through your relationships, but choosing partners who are destined to fail
Yeah.
because you don't want to do the work on the mother wound. But perpetuating that, it keeps showing up in relationship after relationship after relationship.
I was just thinking that when you're talking about healing that, one of the last things that you have to do when mom passed away, what, 3 years ago, I think it
I think
was,
three years ago.
years ago. Yeah, her
Yeah,
birthday was yesterday.
yesterday. Happy birthday, Grandma.
Yeah, I wished her a happy birthday yesterday. And is that you have to figure out that the mother on the outside has to be internalized.
hmm
You have to bring that mother inside, because there is no one to nurture you anymore. I mean, I won't say that you have your friends, but there's no relationship like there is with your mother. So I realized that some years ago and started to do that, to
hmm
internalize my mother without the some of the flaws of
Yeah.
so critical. You know,
hmm
I'm one of the things I know that I got from my mother was mom used to be able to, she looked at anything, but she always found the flaw in whatever it it was that was wrong. And so I learned to do that.
hmm
And then one day I thought, oh my God, I'm always looking at things for what's wrong with them. I need to look at things what's right with them. And
Uh-huh.
that took a lot of work for me to be able to look at something and not being, everybody wants to zero in on a flaw. That took years for me to overcome.
hmm Yep. It's interesting how we all have different mother wounds. And I was thinking of my friend Lori, who's now passed away, but this is a really serious mother wound. She When she was a little girl, she had been abused by her uncle, sexually abused by her uncle, her mother's brother.
Mhm.
And when she brought this to her mother did not support her at all. She
Oh,
denied that. She didn't want to rock the boat in the relationship she had with her brother. So for her, that was one thing that levels of resentment that Lori had lived with for her short life that she had on this planet, but it was what she had. She built everything. I mean, any relationship that she had with other women, as she was growing up, she cultivated relationships mostly with men because she didn't trust women. And it was really hard for her to learn how to trust women and to let women in. And from there, I was really grateful that before Lori had passed, she was able to find a way back to forgiving her mother for that mother wound, which went very, very deep, very, very deep.
I can appreciate that. I mean, I I think I've told you. If I haven't, I know I've told my friend Anne because it's come up in conversation. There was a point when I didn't really. I'm not gay. I did not want to be a woman. I mean, I went into a man's business,
Mm.
and there was one woman and 350 men. Those odds,
Yep.
it was really, really tough. But I preferred to, men had power, they had money, they had influence,
Mm.
they had all the stuff that I wanted in my life and didn't have, and felt like I didn't have. So it was like, that's where, that when you were talking about her having relationships with, I had lots of buddies. I mean, I had
Mm.
men that were really great friends of mine.
Mhm.
And but I didn't really, that's why I never wanted to join women's groups, women's circles. Anne kept after me for a long time to become part of the millionth circle, and I just wanted nothing to do with it.
Mhm.
As eventually she wore me down. I softened. So I didn't trust women either. That
Yeah.
was part of the of what was missing, is that the gossiping that women do,
Mhm.
the infighting, the backbiting, all of
Mhm.
that. And that's what I saw moving up the ladder, in my career. My
Mhm.
other career was all of that. And you just learn to draw yourself in and not share with
Yeah.
people. But men don't have that. They're like, they can have a disagreement. I mean, they be screaming at each other, slap each other in the back, say, let's go for a beer. And it's all over. I mean, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yep, yep, yep. I get it. I get it. And having worked in corporate America, especially when working on ships, I mean, I get being the minority. And I remember when I first stepped on the stage as a cruise director, the only role models had been male cruise directors who were lovely. It's nothing against them, but I could see myself trying to imitate the things that they did and how they did it. And I got to a point where after my first contract and doing that, I came home and got to thinking to myself, man, if I keep doing this job like this, all I'll ever be is a second rate man. I will never be, I will never step into my own sense of self. I mean, granted, dyed my hair dark and
Yeah.
changed the way that I dressed in order to not be judged by women. But I remember later on in my career, I had a staff, all of my immediate managers were all women. And we had crew staff who were male, and we had youth staff who were male. And of course, obviously, with the orchestra, who were my responsibility, those are mostly men. But I had a female musical director, I had a female assistant, I had a female social hostess, I had a female clubhouse director. So I had all female managers. And the hotel director came in one day and said, "Oh my gosh, Yvette, this must be really hard to have all these women as direct reports to you." And I stopped and I kind of cocked my head as I'm doing now. And I thought to myself, actually, No, this was one of the easiest contracts that I did because there was no rooster in the hen house. There was no rooster in the hen house who was trying to compete for the attention of, and there was no level of competition in that way. We all had this cohesiveness that still surprises me today, but it was so delightful. And there's a funny side note to it. We had my assistant went to go do her bingo announcement one day, and we had a helium tank in the office because we used to blow up balloons for
Ah,
gangway on embarkation day. So we all got together, we all sucked helium and then sang bingo, 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 and bingo was his name. Oh, and then peals of laughter infused with helium, and then that was our announcement. The hotel, that's the very same hotel director came, "Blah, blah, 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 blah. You shouldn't do that, blah, 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 it's so unprofessional." But we were on the floor hysterical laughing at that, and she had the best bingo turnout that she'd ever had.
that's a great
Yes.
story.
Yeah, so much fun. Oh my gosh, that's so much fun. um so I just wanted to share because like I said, I had the father wound as a result of your divorce, and the subsequent dissolving of any real relationship I had or even have with my dad. But in doing that inner child work, because even though you were doing the reparenting of yourself, I still needed to do that for myself too, because that was a missing component for me. And one author who really helped me do a lot of inner child work, I happened, much like you had walked into the bookstore and there was John Bradshaw's book right there on the counter. I was in Alaska and I was in Juneau. There was a phenomenal bookstore in Juneau down a side street. I used to love to go there. And I went in, and there on the counter was a book by a writer by the name of Sark, Sark.
Yes, yes.
And everything she writes literally with a crayon or a magic marker. So the inner child resonated, and went, "Oh, that one."
That
So
one.
yep. And it was about wild women, juicy, living juicy, and something about wild women. I have to go back and find the title. But it was so impactful, especially working in such a male dominated environment as the cruise industry. And it really helped me come into the fullness of myself to be able to relax as a woman doing that job and not feeling like I had to be masculine in doing it.
I do want to say one thing so that people understand something. Your father and I had a divorce, but I never divorced his family.
Hmm.
You know, your grandparents stayed in your life, and your aunt and uncle, and all those relatives. I made sure that when you were a kid, you got to visit your grandmother. When we moved to the other side of Pennsylvania from where they lived, but you still
Hmm.
got to spend weekends with them. And I also want to say, I never said anything about your father. I mean,
Mm.
it wasn't,
No.
I did not want to influence the the opinion that you had of your father. I thought someday you would find that out for
Yeah.
yourself. It was better done then when you
Yeah.
full capacities to understand.
Uh,
And so that, I think that's a really a big thing for women, not to influence their children's opinions of their fathers.
mhm. Yeah, let kids find their own way
Yes.
to it. It really helps because I think that part of the problem that kids end up with is because they see the other parent in their best light, and because they're not in the household and able to interact, we tend to put them on a pedestal. We put them up high. We look up to them, we want to be like them. We want to emulate. And then we hear the day-to-day drudgery from the other parent who's stuck in an emotional battle with the ex. And it puts us at odds. It's so confusing for a kid. It's completely a mixed messages. And one of my favorite sayings is mixed messages equal mixed results. And you're asking a kid to try and navigate adult emotions when they don't even know exactly what love is in the first place. They have an idea of what love is, but not the complexity of what love is, or what we make, how complex we make love. Yeah.
Well, I think we've kind of, I won't say we've exhausted the subject because I think there's probably more to talk about, but I think the part that concerns you and I in this conversation, I can't think of anything else that was really important to the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Discuss. Do you have anything left over?
Yeah, I have one last thing I'd like to share, because although I never felt the mother wound, a conscious expression of it because of our relationship. And I mentioned Bruce Lipton's epigenetics and what we can impact in our children when they're in the womb. And what I have learned through studying breath work, and how we learn to breathe is by observing parents, et cetera, et cetera. But in growing up, the one mother wound that I came to realize was that when you got pregnant with me, grandma wanted you to have an abortion,
Yeah.
and so you could go to college and fulfill your dream of being a journalist. And in growing up with that knowledge, until this past year, in the back of my mind, I have known that you love me. There's no doubt in my mind that you love me. But did you want me was a big thing, because I was forced on you, because grandma wanted otherwise. And
Yeah.
in having me, it put off you living your dream. As you said, you were 50 by the time you actually began to live your dream. So in the back of my mind, I always wondered if I was really wanted, if you really did want me. And it wasn't until I did my fourth ketamine journey that, I've read about people who have gone back to their birth, and, in doing these, ayahuasca journeys, et cetera, et cetera. And I was always, yeah, whatever, but then in that journey, that's where I went to. And I remember calling you afterwards to say, now I know that I was loved from the beginning, and I was wanted from the beginning. And that changed everything.
And I want to say that under the conditions I was born under, my mother and father never married. I mean, my mother got pregnant, and you can imagine this was back in 1946, and
Mm-hmm.
that's unheard of. And her parents made her hide in a room when anybody came to the house. And they wanted my mother to go away with my aunt and have the baby, and then I would come home as my aunt's child.
Mm-hmm.
And so I I grew up with high levels of anxiety, which, I haven't, I mean, I won't say that I've totally recovered from them, because they come back occasionally. Through breath work is where I will give credit for that. And yoga nidra, that's where I
Mm-hmm.
give two things credit. But I think that I can trace that back. That's My mother was an anxious person, and
Mm-hmm.
she was I'm sure she must have been anxious when she was a kid and when she got pregnant, and then having to hide and not be seen by people.
Mm-hmm.
I had to have inherited that in the womb. That came from the womb. That's why it was so hard to heal.
Mm-hmm.
And so today I can breathe better and relax more into the moment, and I live more in the moment. That's the important part, is that when you recover from that mother wound, that anxiety, all that, you get to live in the present moment. And that's so rich for someone who has been beaten up by the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. If anything, if anybody gets anything out of this, John Bradshaw, Melanie Beatty, Yoga Nidra, breath
Mm-hmm.
work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. The breath work alone will help you work through trauma. yoga nidras, and as a serious meditation practice. And I say serious not as, oh my gosh, I have to learn to meditate, but it's meditation really helps you learn how to appreciate your life. That's what I have come to a place with, and appreciating the simple things, because simplicity, we want to dismiss simplicity and say, it has to be complicated in order for me to appreciate it. But when you undo and you unravel that thread and go back to the source of where that thread started, there's pure simplicity. And in being able to appreciate the simplicities gives you an opportunity, it's an open door to appreciating every little thing that comes in front of you. It's, being on a bike ride and a butterfly just flits across your tire, and you just slow down enough to let the butterfly go, but you pause to watch it go, and those little gifts that you give yourself are just like, I don't know, drops of wisdom that come, but it's from a place of self-realization. That's for sure.
It's a good place to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Feels
Yes,
good.
it is. Yes, it is. Well,
Feels
I
good.
think
Feels good to go to bed in that, and it feels good to wake up in that.
you get to marinate in it.
Yes.
And in that, the problems don't seem to be so overwhelming. They seem to be manageable. And when you remember just to breathe through it, um, you just kind of relax back away from it and gives you different perspective on things.
I think that what it is that people are afraid of their emotions, their feelings, and so they're afraid that they'll be overwhelmed by them,
Yep.
but they're just passing through. And if we let them pass through us, whether it's joy, whether it's sadness or whatever, it'll pass. It's when
Hmm.
we hang on to it and cling to it that it causes a problem. So
I tell my students in yoga nidra class, and I also bring this into yoga therapy classes now, but we have emotions, we have feelings, and we have sensation. And when we begin to recognize the difference in that, we lighten up, and our bodies actually kick into high gear, and it helps us to heal and to release old memories, right? So one day, one of my students said, well, what's the difference between the three? And I said, well, sensation is sensation. It's being able to feel the breeze going across your exposed skin. It's feeling your breath in and out of your nostrils. That's sensation. It's your body telling you that you're tired because you've gone past your edge and you need to sleep. So it's cues the body sends out to say, hey, I'm here.
mhm.
And then feelings are those, they're not emotions yet. There's just feelings of happy, sad, frustrated. It's the complexity of the human condition of what's going on in the moment. It can be excitement, it can be failure, it can be all these things, but their feelings are free of judgment. They become emotions when the mind steps in and wants to qualify them as, this is a good emotion, this is a bad emotion, that it's either A or B. So the mind puts it, views those feelings as through the eyes of judgment. So as a result, then they become emotions, which then get stuck. And then we begin to repeat that same emotional pattern over and over and over and over and over, until one day we're just over it. And then we decide we want to let go of the emotion and just experience life as it is, and then go back to feeling, and through the ability for sensation to come through, and just appreciate everything good, whether it's a good or a bad, doesn't matter. We just free of judgment. It's just, it just
It
is.
is what it is. That's what
Hmm.
it is. What
Yeah,
it is.
it is what it is. It is what it is.
That's a good note to end on, don't you think?
Yeah, I
It
think
is
so.
what it is.
It is what it is. So I think that I'll make a note for our next podcast, and we can circle back and touch on anything that we maybe missed out on touching on with the mother wound. Obviously, it was a bigger conversation that we wound up in than just, let's talk about this, and then we'll go to that. And then next time we can talk about growth versus happiness, because I think that's a really that's
Yes.
a big topic as well.
Okay. So
All right. So
I'm,
thank you for listening and tuning in. And again, my name is Yvette. I'm the daughter.
and I'm Linda. I'm the mother.
So we are Spacebar, mindful pauses for conscious conversation. Thanks for joining us and stay tuned for more episodes. Bye for now.